Paris, 1314. Two young knights were arrested on the orders of the King of France. Their crime was not treason. They had not tried to assassinate the king. They were accused of something that, at first, seemed far more private. They had allegedly been sleeping with two women from the French royal family, but these were not just any women. They were the wives of the king's sons, women expected to give birth to the future kings of France. And if the accusations were true, suddenly no one could be completely certain whose children they were carrying. The investigation would end with torture, brutal executions, shaved heads, imprisoned princesses, and one suspicious death. And it may all have been exposed because of two embroidered purses. Before we uncover one of the most scandalous affairs in French royal history, subscribe for more dark and scandalous stories from the past. Because what began as whispers about adultery would soon become a crisis for the French crown. At the beginning of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, appeared to have done everything a medieval king was supposed to do to secure his dynasty. He had three surviving sons. Louis, his eldest, was married to Margaret of Burgundy. His second son, Philip, was married to Joan of Burgundy, and his youngest, Charles, had married Joan's sister, Blanche of Burgundy. Philip also had a daughter, Isabella, who had married King Edward II of England. Through these marriages, Philip had surrounded his family with powerful alliances. The future of the Capetian dynasty appeared safe. But behind the carefully arranged royal marriages, things were far less perfect. Margaret's marriage to Louis appears to have been unhappy. Charles and Blanche were not remembered as an especially affectionate couple either. Only Philip and Joan seem to have enjoyed a relatively close marriage, and in 1313, one small gift would begin to expose just how fragile the royal family really was. The person who supposedly first became suspicious was Philip IV's own daughter, Isabella of France. Isabella was already Queen of England and had returned to France with her husband Edward II. According to several accounts, during the visit, she gave embroidered silk purses to her brothers and their wives. It was an innocent enough royal gift. But sometime later, Isabella reportedly noticed something strange. Two Norman knights named Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay appeared wearing purses like the ones she had given her sisters-in-law. That did not automatically prove anything. In medieval court culture, gifts could pass between people, and women sometimes gave personal favors to knights. But to Isabella, the sight was suspicious enough to raise a disturbing possibility. Had her sisters-in-law given the knights intimate gifts? And if so, why? Isabella eventually informed her father. Philip IV did not immediately drag his daughters-in-law before the court. Instead, he reportedly had them watched, and what his men claimed to discover was explosive. The investigation focused on an old guard tower beside the Seine, known as the Tour de Nesle. Later tradition would turn the tower into a place of almost legendary sexual corruption. The truth is more difficult to establish, but contemporary accusations claimed that Margaret and Blanche had been secretly meeting the d'Aunay brothers and committing adultery. Joan was also implicated, although primarily as someone who knew what was happening and failed to expose it. For a medieval royal family, this was not simply embarrassing, it was potentially catastrophic. A princess married to a future king had one central political responsibility: producing legitimate heirs. If Margaret or Blanche were sleeping with other men, then the legitimacy of any child they gave birth to could be questioned. This was not merely a jealous husband discovering an affair. It threatened the bloodline of the French monarchy. Philip IV ordered the knights arrested, and once they were in royal custody, the investigation became brutal. Gautier and Philippe d'Aulnay were interrogated under torture. Eventually, they confessed to having sexual relationships with the royal women, but this is where we have to be careful. A confession extracted under torture is hardly reliable evidence by modern standards, and historians have debated exactly how much of the accusation can be accepted. Some medieval accounts even suggested that the entire scandal had been manufactured as part of a political conspiracy. Most historians nevertheless tend to accept that Margaret and Blanche probably did have affairs with the two knights. Once the confessions were obtained, there would be little mercy. The exact details of the brothers' executions differ depending on the source. Accounts describe castration, mutilation, flaying, breaking on the wheel, and eventual decapitation. What can be said with confidence is that their deaths were deliberately horrific and public. They had not simply slept with married women, they had been accused of violating women belonging to the royal dynasty. And Philip IV intended their punishment to send a message. The knights were destroyed. Now came the turn of the princesses. Margaret and Blanche were found guilty of adultery. Their royal status did not save them from public humiliation. Their hair was shaved, stripping away one of the most visible symbols of noble femininity, and they were sentenced to imprisonment at Chateau Gaillard, a formidable fortress in Normandy. For women who had lived among the highest levels of European nobility, the transformation was astonishing. One moment, they were princesses married to future kings. The next, they were disgraced prisoners. Joan's situation was different. She was accused of knowing about the affairs and helping conceal them, rather than being conclusively found guilty of adultery herself. She was confined at Dourdan. But unlike the husbands of Margaret and Blanche, Joan's husband, Philip, stood by her. Eventually, she was released. That decision would later prove extremely important, because one of these disgraced women would become Queen of France, and another would become queen while still a prisoner. Only months after the scandal exploded, King Philip IV died. The crown passed to his eldest son, who became Louis X of France. That meant Louis's imprisoned wife Margaret technically became Queen of France. France now had a queen who was locked away for adultery. Louis faced an obvious problem. He needed legitimate heirs, but his wife was alive, imprisoned, and disgraced. An annulment was difficult to obtain, particularly because the papacy was going through a period without a reigning pope. Then, in 1315, the problem suddenly disappeared. Margaret died inside Chateau Gaillard. She was still very young. Rumors quickly developed that her death had not been natural. Later stories suggested that she may have been strangled so Louis could marry again. There is no solid proof that Margaret was murdered, but the timing was convenient. Only days later, Louis remarried. His new wife was Clementia of Hungary. The king finally had another chance to produce the male heir France desperately needed, but the royal family's problems were only beginning. Louis X died in 1316. His second wife was pregnant when he died, so France waited to discover whether she would give birth to a boy or a girl. She gave birth to a son. For a moment, the succession crisis appeared to be over. The newborn became King John I of France. Then, only 5 days later, the baby died. France was suddenly faced with a question it had managed to avoid for centuries. What happened when a French king died without a surviving son? Louis did have a daughter from his marriage to Margaret. Her name was Joan. Under a straightforward hereditary system, she had an obvious claim. But Joan carried the shadow of her mother's scandal. If Margaret had committed adultery, some people could question whether Louis was really Joan's father. Louis himself had recognized her as his daughter, but politically, the uncertainty was useful to someone else. Louis's brother Philip wanted the throne, and he was not going to let his young niece stand between him and the crown. Philip took control and was crowned Philip V of France in 1317. His niece Joan was passed over. The reasoning was bigger than simply questioning her parentage. A political principle was established that women could not succeed to the French crown. This was not yet the fully developed Salic law argument that later generations would use, but the precedent was enormously important. And it immediately produced an extraordinary irony. Philip V was married to Joan of Burgundy, the only one of the three princesses who had escaped the Tour de Nesle scandal with her marriage intact. They had children, but they had no surviving son. So, when Philip V died in 1322, his own daughters were excluded from the throne under the same principle that had helped make him king. The crown passed to his younger brother, Charles IV. Charles had been married to Blanche, one of the women convicted in the scandal. Their marriage was eventually annulled. Charles remarried. Then he married again. But despite multiple marriages, he failed to leave a surviving son. And in 1328, Charles IV died. The direct male Capetian line was finished. Now the French monarchy faced an even larger succession crisis. One potential claimant was Philip of Valois, a male line cousin of the dead king. But another claimant had a fascinating connection to the Tour de Nesle affair. Edward III of England. Edward was the son of Isabella of France. The same Isabella who, according to tradition, had noticed those embroidered purses and exposed her sisters-in-law years earlier. Through his mother, Edward was the grandson of Philip IV. But French political leaders rejected the idea that a woman who could not herself inherit the throne could transmit that right to her son. Philip of Valois became Philip VI of France. Edward eventually challenged the Valois claim. That dynastic dispute became one important element in the tensions that led to the 100 Years' War between England and France. It would be misleading to say that two silk purses single-handedly caused a century of war. The conflict had major territorial, political, and economic causes as well, but the scandal had helped create uncertainty around royal legitimacy and was part of the chain of events that shaped the succession crises of 1316 and 1328. And there is one final twist. Isabella of France had helped expose women accused of betraying their royal husbands. Years later, Isabella's own marriage to Edward II of England collapsed spectacularly. She formed a powerful relationship with Roger Mortimer, joined the invasion that overthrew her husband, and became one of the dominant political figures in England. Edward II later died in captivity under circumstances that became the subject of centuries of suspicion and legend. So the princess, remembered for exposing one of medieval France's greatest adultery scandals, would eventually find herself at the center of an equally sensational royal story of her own. History has a sense of irony. The Tour de Nesle affair began with something almost ridiculously small, a pair of embroidered purses. From there came surveillance, accusations of secret sex, torture, executions, 3 ruined princesses, a queen dying in captivity, and questions about whether royal children were truly legitimate. But its greatest impact was not what happened inside the tower, it was what happened afterward. Within 14 years of the scandal, all three of Philip IV's sons had become kings, and all three died without leaving a surviving male heir. The dynasty Philip had worked so carefully to protect collapsed. A new family took the French throne. An English king claimed that throne for himself, and Europe moved toward one of the longest conflicts of the Middle Ages. Were Margaret and Blanche truly guilty? Most historians believe the affairs probably happened, but torture, contradictory chronicles, and centuries of sensational retellings mean we may never know every detail. What we do know is that in 1314, the private lives of a handful of people inside the French court became a matter of national importance. Because when the women involved are expected to give birth to kings, an affair is never just an affair.